Welcome to the 9th annual Prairie's Got the Goods Week. This is our second webinar happening this week. And if you don't know, my name is Caitlin Rose Seiler. I'm the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, I'm really excited that Jordan Phelps from the Pollinator Partnership Canada will be speaking about pollinators, their importance, and how we support them. I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are in the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Before we get going, I'd like to mention that we have 3 more webinars happening this week, all about the goods and services provided by the prairie ecosystem. And new this year, we have a coffee table conversation where we'll be interviewing a lifelong agricultural producer to showcase ranching stewardship. And you can register for all of these webinars on the PCAP's website. Just click on upcoming events and then Prairie's Got the Goods Week. And a reminder to our listeners out there, you'll be muted for the duration of the presentation. But if you have any questions at all during the webinar, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation, but questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar. Prairie's Got the Goods Week is presented by Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, North American Helium, Nutrien, and SaskTel. And I'm delighted to introduce today's presenter. Jordan Phelps is the Bee City Program Coordinator for Pollinator Partnership Canada. His passion for pollinators was sparked as an undergraduate at Western University, where he studied animal cognition and learned about the incredible feats of learning and memory that bees and other small-brained but mentally mighty pollinators are capable of. He went on to complete a Master's of Science at Western in neuroscience, where he studied how exposure to common pesticides impacts the ability of bumblebees to learn about and gather food from flowers. This experience has launched a lifelong interest in pollinators, not only for the good of our food crops and the ecosystem, but also because they're fascinating creatures to watch and learn from. Jordan is delighted to bring his passion to Bee City, Canada, where he works with municipalities, campuses, and schools to make meaningful change to pollinators. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Jordan.
Perfect. Thank you for the introduction. I'll just see if I can share my screen here. How's that looking?
Perfect.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for having me. Great to see such a strong turnout as well. As Caitlin mentioned, my name is Jordan Phelps. I'm the Bee City Canada program coordinator, and that's just one of the programs that we offer through Pollinator Partnership Canada. So in this talk, I'll kick things off by talking about what pollination even is. Then I'll talk about who the pollinators are, why they're important, and then get into a lot of the different actions that we can take to support them. All right, so before we talk about pollinators, it's important to discuss what pollination actually is. So at the most basic, pollination is the movement of pollen grains, which are the reproductive material of plants, from the male parts of the plant to the female parts of the plant. So this is the process that needs to happen before fertilization can occur, and then eventually seed and fruit production, resulting in the foods that we enjoy and the next generation of plants. So pollination can occur in a few ways. Some plants actually can self-pollinate, meaning that the pollen from the same flower or plant can actually result in fertilization. In most cases, though, plants rely on typically wind or animals to move their pollen between flowers. When we're thinking about wind-pollinated plants, the strategy is typically to produce as much pollen as possible, lots of small pollen grains, and throw them into the wind, hoping that some are going to land on another plant and cause fertilization. So this is a bit of a scattershot approach. More often, plants rely on animal pollinators to move their pollen. And this works really well because it's a mutual benefit to the plants and the animals. So the plants offer food in the form of pollen, of course, which is a really important protein source for pollinators that they'll bring back to feed the developing bees or other insects. And then nectar, which is their carbohydrate source. So this is what gives them energy to move around from flower to flower. So you look at this diagram on the slide here, you can see a bee happily moving between flowers, drinking nectar, gathering pollen. And as this bee or any other animal pollinators move between flowers collecting food, they incidentally leave some pollen from previously visited flowers, which is able to fertilize the plant. So say pollination really is one of the great mutualisms of the natural world. Less scientifically, one of the best win-wins out there in biology. So that's what pollination is. So now, what about the pollinators? How many of them are out there? Who are they? I'm sure everybody is very familiar with this one, the honeybee. Most people know that the honeybee is a really important pollinator. Often they know about the honeybee through messaging about save the bees, which honeybees are often the stars of. Talks about honeybee declines. And of course, people know about the honeybee because of honey. People love honey, makes sense, it's delicious. Honeybees, undoubtedly the single most important pollinator for agriculture as well. They're domesticated. They come in very big colonies. They're easy to move around the country. So you can actually bring these bees to the crops that need pollination at any given time in the year. But honeybees are not the only pollinators. In fact, they're actually non-native pollinators. Therefore, they're not pollinators that are of conservation concern. We do see winter losses of honeybees. And I know in recent years it's been bad, and this year it's been looking like it's been particularly rough for honeybees. But they are kind of an an economic organism in a sense that they're often, the populations are restored through the hard work of beekeepers, through splitting colonies, importing new queens. So very important pollinators, but not of conservation concern. But there are many wild native pollinator species that are also essential for the pollination of both our crops and wild plants. And many of these are of conservation concern because they don't have the support of beekeepers to keep the populations going. So when we think of pollination, it's important that we're thinking beyond honeybees. Even if we're just thinking about bees, we've got all kinds of species. You can see a few in these pictures I've got here. We've got bumblebees, sweat bees, the little green guy there, mason bees, carpenter bees, leafcutter bees, longhorned bees. Those ones are particularly cute. There's actually over 800 species of bees in Canada, and there's over 20,000 species of bees worldwide. And many of these bees play an important role in crop pollination as well. But that is only the bees. When we're talking about pollinators, we've got to think of all these other animals as well. We've got different types of flies, butterflies, moths, beetles, wasps, hummingbirds, even some species of mammals. You can see in one of these pictures, there's the honey possum as a really cool mammal pollinator. There's lizards as well. And most recently, I think a year or two ago at this point, there was a frog that was identified as a potential pollinator. So there's now a research program studying that particular frog species to see the extent to which they're capable of pollinating too. So basically the point I'm trying to make is there's a lot of important pollinators beyond honeybees, beyond bees. In total, it's been estimated that there's about 350,000 different species of animal pollinators out there. So the diversity is pretty crazy. And in the spirit of Prairie's Got the Goods Week, I did want to highlight a handful of cool pollinators that can be found in Saskatchewan. So a few of these are bumblebees, because bumblebees are really cute as far as insects go. They're also relatively large, so they can be more easily identified by people. I also love the bumblebees with that orange coloration, so I wanted to highlight a couple of those. The first one I've got here is Hunt's bumblebee. This is a bee that's native to kind of the west of North America. I believe it can't be found east of Manitoba. Then we've also got the tricolored bumblebee. This is a bumblebee that can be found across most of Canada. So a couple cool orange colored bumblebees there. And then the third one I wanted to highlight is the indiscriminate cuckoo bumblebee. This one's pretty interesting. Probably some of you are familiar with the cuckoo bird, which is known as a brood parasite. The bird lays its eggs in the nests of other birds, and then that bird will take care of its young. There's actually quite a bit of many bees that are also brood parasites that do something similar. So the queen of the indiscriminate cuckoo bumblebee will take over the nests of other bumblebee species and start laying eggs. And then the workers of the species that they've taken over will actually gather food to support the growing of their species. So bumblebees can actually be pretty ruthless. So an interesting species to highlight. A few more. We've got the Milwaukee mining bee, which, as the name suggests, this is a ground nesting bee, a pretty cute one. We've got the Macropus cuckoo bee. This is another parasitic bee. And this is one that was actually, it hadn't been seen in Canada for, I believe, about 65 years. And recently it was discovered by researchers in Grasslands National Park in Saskatchewan. And I believe it was also rediscovered somewhere out east on the coast. So pretty exciting to be seeing this bee again after so many years that we thought it wasn't present in Canada. And then lastly, I wanted to highlight a non-bee pollinator in the Canadian swallowtail butterfly, another beautiful species. This one can be found across much of Canada. Okay, so we've covered how pollination works. We've covered the diversity of animal pollinators that are out there, but how important really is animal pollination? And I know I've hinted at this a little bit, but just wanted to go into a little bit more depth on the importance. It's incredibly important for sustaining our ecosystems. There's actually an estimated 87.5% of wild plant species benefit from or absolutely require animal pollinators in order to reproduce. So when we're talking about sustaining ecosystems, it's not just a small subset of plants that rely on animal pollinators. It's actually the vast majority of plants out there. So we really need these pollinators to keep plants reproducing and keep our ecosystems going. And I mentioned the diversity of pollinators, and this diversity is also incredibly important here when we're talking about sustaining ecosystems. So I mentioned how there's all kinds of different groups of pollinators like bees, moths, bats, flies, and a lot of these different groups and even particular species have evolved very specialized relationships with plants. So one example of this is bats and moths, because they tend to be active at night. They've evolved relationships with certain plants that have generally more pale white scented flowers. These species have all co-evolved together. The flowers are pale because vision is less useful at night. They're scented because smell can be a really important cue when vision is less effective. Hummingbirds, another example, they tend to be in particular attracted to red flowers. So hummingbirds are often very important pollinators of plants with red flowers. Even thinking about bees, there's some species of bees that are generalists that'll go to all kinds of plants, honeybees being one. Many bumblebees are like that. But then there's some species of bees that have very specific relationships with plants. And there, in a lot of cases, there's species that depend on a particular species. So this pollinator diversity is incredibly important for plant diversity. They've evolved together, plants and pollinators, to arrive at this complexity that we see in our ecosystems. And keeping this diversity going is important to keep the complexity of our ecosystems going as well. And of course, we know pollinators are absolutely essential to our food production. So you can see here, I've got pictures of a lot of foods that require or benefit from pollination, including lots of fruits. We've got cherries, apples, strawberries, blueberries, pears, all kinds of good stuff. Lots of nuts. I've got almonds here. Um, Also, two very important things, coffee, this is critical for me, and cacao, which is critical for creating chocolate. So a lot of really good stuff. Um, some of you may have heard the phrase that pollinators are responsible for 1 in 3 bites of food that we eat. And this is absolutely true. But I do like to say the story is a little bit more complex than that. It's actually 75% of the most important crops that are grown for human consumption that benefit from or depend on animal pollinators. So actually, most of these crops are dependent or benefit from to some extent. But where we get that 1 in 3 bites of food is because the 25% of crops that don't benefit from animal pollinators, this is composed of a lot of these wind pollinated crops. So things like grains, and these are things that make up a very large portion of our diet by volume, like in terms of the calories that we're consuming. But the pollinated foods, which are the majority, tend to be the ones that we eat in smaller quantities. But these are things that make our diets really enjoyable, things that give us lots of micronutrients, lots of flavor. So it's actually the 1 in 3 bites of food is accurate and it's very helpful, but it's actually much more in terms of the percentage of crops that are dependent on animal pollinators or benefit from them. And then going back to the importance of biodiversity, so crop pollination is also a really big team effort. This figure here shows the importance of different pollinator groups to different crops. So you can see the honeybees are represented in the dark blue, other species of bees in the light blue, and then there's all kinds of other pollinators thrown in there too. You can see flies, different groups of flies are represented in the yellow and the white. So at a glance, you can see bees are obviously doing a lot of work. They're the most important single pollinator group. You can see honeybees are visiting watermelon and almond, for example, at a higher frequency than other animals are. Strawberry is a mix of honeybees and other bees in this case. But then there's some crops like mango here that's received visits from a wide variety of non-bee pollinators. So this really shows this picture that honeybees as a single species, very important. Bees as a whole, very important, but other pollinators are doing really important work. And in some cases, doing more work than bees for particular crops. So I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about how we can support pollinators. But first, I wanted to identify just some of the factors that are threatening them. This is important to know in terms of how we can support them. And the biggest factor is habitat loss. Habitat is food and shelter for pollinators. If we didn't have food and shelter for ourselves, we would obviously be in trouble. We've lost quite a bit of habitat over the years to things like expanding agriculture, urban development, other activities. So incredibly important that we take steps to reduce habitat destruction and create new habitat. Some other significant threats to note, one being climate change. Obviously, climate change impacts many things, but one of the ways that pollinators are impacted is by changing temperatures, actually causing a mismatch between when pollinators emerge from overwintering in the spring and when plants are blooming in the spring. There's been some really good research showing in some cases, either the emergence of pollinators in the spring, the flower bloom time, or both have shifted. So that certain pollinator species actually don't have access to food from the critical plants that they rely on when they emerge. And then likewise, plants don't have access to the pollinators that they need when they're blooming. So this is definitely not good. And if the times are kind of splitting out further and further, this can result in declines in particular pollinators and also declines in plants that aren't able to reproduce as effectively. Invasive species, of course, are a concern too. Invasive plants in particular can outcompete native plants that pollinators depend on. In a lot of cases, pollinators that are native have these very intricate relationships with native plants. They've evolved over many, many years. But then also we can have invasive pollinator species that come in and outcompete native pollinators for food. So both of these can be a concern. Agrochemical use can also be problematic. Very important that integrated pest management is used so that we can ensure certain chemicals are only used when they're absolutely needed. A lot of these chemicals can have lethal impacts on pollinators, but much more often when we're talking about these chemicals, the impacts are sublethal. And a lot of these sublethal impacts can be additive and have negative impacts on pollinator populations over time. So often we're talking about things like weakened ability to fight off disease, cognitive impairments. These are things that can decrease learning and memory, which can impact their ability to gather food, also their ability to navigate their environment and return to the nest. This is a topic that I studied for my master's degree. So that was really interesting to study. And I know from that experience that these impacts can be extremely subtle. So it's important to study these to know what the impacts are of different chemicals. And then finally, a last one, parasites and pathogens. Things such as the varroa mite in particular on honeybees. These can have a very major impact on pollinators. And as I mentioned, some of these can interact with different agrochemicals. So they can, if a pollinator is dealing with both of these, the effects can be additive. Okay, so that's it for the threats. Now we'll turn things in a more positive direction and talk about what we can all do to support pollinators. So I mentioned habitat loss is the #1 factor limiting the survival of pollinators. Guess what? Habitat creation is the best thing we can do to support them. By creating habitat, we're providing pollinators with access to food and shelter, which is absolutely critical. So if we're creating habitat, which plants are going to make the biggest difference for pollinators? This is the question that we get asked all the time through our info ad email. And the answer is we want to prioritize plants that are native to your area. These are the plants that have been around long enough to establish relationships with the native pollinators in your area. They're also adapted to the environmental conditions of your region. So many of them can be relatively easy to grow, don't require a whole bunch of supplemental inputs. I actually created a native plant garden long before I felt like I had a really great idea of what I was doing in the garden. And most of the plants that I stuck in the ground ended up doing pretty well. And I will not credit myself to that. I would credit it to a lot of these plants evolved in my area and just were adapted and prepared to do well in the area. A lot of these native plants can actually be really beautiful as well when they're in bloom. I know a lot of people think native plants sometimes are not as nice because they don't bloom all growing season like some ornamental plants do. But when they're in bloom, a lot of them look beautiful. And this is just an argument for making sure that you're planting a diversity of plants so that throughout the growing season, there's always something growing. So then something nice for you to look at, but then also something that's providing pollinators with food throughout the entire growing season. So if you're wondering which plants to get, this is just a quick prioritization framework. So the best is to get local native. How does local native differ from native? The plants have been sourced locally. So at times people will order native plants. These are native to the region, but they may have been grown farther away under different climatic conditions. Um, so ideally, you would source native plants that have been grown locally and are um, used to the climatic conditions locally. Overall, though, native plants are what we want. Um, some non-native plants are also fine as long as they're not invasive plants. Lots of non-native plants can look really beautiful, provide pollinators with loads of food, and not be a problem in terms of kind of spreading and outcompeting native plants. So some non-natives totally okay as long as they're not invasive. What you absolutely don't want to plant is an invasive plant that can be a threat to native plant communities, or a noxious plant that can actually be harmful to people. And if you're interested in creating habitat and you want some additional help with plant selection, we've got a whole bunch of eco-regional planting guides. If you go on the Pollinator Partnership Canada website, these guides give you a good idea of what plants that you might want to include in your garden, what types of pollinators each of these plants might attract, and then lots of other information about different pollinator groups in your region. So you can see this image here on the slide. We have a guide for the moist mixed grassland ecoregion. This is the ecoregion that includes Saskatoon and Regina. But we've also got other eco-regional guides for different areas of the province too. Even easier though, you can access the Find Your Roots tool. This is also on the Pollinator Partnership Canada website. You basically open this up, you can plug in your postal code. It'll give you a nice list of native plants based on where you live. But then you can also refine it further. Depending on different preferences you have. So for example, if you wanted red flowers, you could choose, I only want a red flower, or you could do a couple different colors. You can specify the height of the plants if you don't want plants to be too tall, or if you're looking for something especially tall. You can input information about the type of soil you have to make sure it'll work there. So this is a really good tool to get a specific list of plants that'll work in your area. So habitat is the best thing that we probably can all do as individuals. Whether you're a farmer with the ability to do things like creating hedgerows on your land for pollinators, whether you're someone with a yard that can create lots of habitat there, or even somebody that lives in a high rise but has some space on the balcony for some native potted plants. Habitat's critical. But the other really important thing that we can do is spread the word to our family, to our friends, to our network, just generally tell people how cool pollinators are, how many are out there, why it's important, and what they can do to help, ideally creating habitat. One really good time to do this is during Pollinator Week. This is the third week of June, so it's coming up in a little bit. If you ever were to host an event for Pollinator Week in your area, you can also visit the Pollinator Partnership website and get your event added to a map of events that are happening across North America for Pollinator Week. Another way that you can support pollinators is to participate in programs that we have available through Pollinator Partnership Canada. We've got lots of different programs. They provide opportunities to create habitat and also opportunities just to learn more about pollinators. So the first program that I wanted to mention is Pollinator Stewardship Certification Training. This is a program that's highly education focused. There's 8 separate learning modules. It kind of starts out in the first week with an intro to pollinators and their diversity. And then as you move through the different sessions, it goes through all kinds of different ways to create habitat in different areas, how to educate about pollinators. Each module is kind of like a webinar, and there's about one per week for a couple months. And then after all of these education sessions, participants are required to take 2 actions in their personal lives. So one action to create habitat, another action to do some kind of public education or engagement effort. And then once you submit that, you receive a pollinator steward pin in the mail, and then you get access to a badge as well for your email signature. So this is a program Pollinator Partnership runs every spring. It's actually going on right now. And we've got about 1,000 people that participate each year. So it's a pretty popular program, really good option if what you want to do is increase your knowledge about pollinators. Another one that I'll touch on is Bee Friendly Gardening. This is a membership program that allows you to register your pollinator garden on a map and gain access to signage for your garden. There's also lots of other benefits, and you don't necessarily need to have a garden to participate. For example, there's a monthly newsletter. They do quarterly webinars. There's a community Facebook page for people to discuss pollinators in their gardening. And they've also got badges that you can use to increase your participation, such as badges for certain types of habitat accomplishments and badges for engagement in community science efforts. So like taking pictures of what's in your garden and uploading that to the iNaturalist page. So Bee Friendly Gardening is a really good option if what you're interested in doing is likely creating habitat, but then also joining a community and looking for some additional ways to engage. Another program is Bee Friendly Farming, dedicated to supporting pollinators on farms. So this is a really good option for growers that would like to take steps to support pollinators and receive formal certification for their efforts, or for growers that already have been taking efforts to support pollinators and then want to have this recognized. So having acreage certified through BFF requires you to take a number of concrete actions to support pollinators. So things like meeting specific habitat requirements and also engaging in an integrated pest management plan. So if you happen to be a grower and you're interested in bee-friendly farming, or if you're interested in either of the other programs that I mentioned, you can check out the Pollinator Partnership Canada website to read a bit more about those. And then, of course, we've got Bee City Canada, which is the program that I myself work on. This is a program that recognizes and supports Canadian municipalities, also campuses and schools, in taking action to support pollinators. So when a member joins this program, they make 3 core commitments. That's kind of the main thing with the program. They commit to creating and maintaining habitat. They commit to educating and engaging their community about pollinators. And then they also commit to celebrating during Pollinator Week or other times of the year. And we actually don't have any Saskatchewan municipalities that are participating in Bee City. So if this sounds interesting to you, we would love for you to bring the idea forward to the community. We would love to have some more members from Saskatchewan. So last year, as part of our work through Bee City, we actually released a program handbook. This is aimed at municipalities. We're working on one for campuses as well, but the municipalities one is complete. And essentially what it does is it provides an action framework for communities to support pollinators. And it provides actions within those 3 core commitments that I just described. So habitat actions, education engagement actions, and then celebration actions. It's also got about 100 examples from different municipalities across Canada. So within each of those actions, there's about 2 or 3 examples, just a paragraph and often pictures to provide some flavor about how different municipalities are actually doing these actions across the country. So I'm going to take the rest of my time in this talk to go through some of these things municipalities are doing. If you're interested in learning more about some of these things, you can go to our website, Bee City Canada's website. It's a separate website from Bee City Canada and Pollinator Partnership Canada. and you can download the handbook from there. So as I mentioned, the book is divided into 3 sections. These represent each of the commitments that BCD members make. So we've got that habitat, we've got engaging and educating the community, and then we've got celebrating. So first, I'm going to get into some of the habitat actions. And the first one I've got here, this is kind of one of the most basic types of habitat projects within a municipality, creating native plant gardens. So these can be created in parks, downtown areas with high foot traffic, especially demonstration gardens. If these are gardens that have signage that teach people how to create native plant gardens, these are really good options for busier areas. They can be created on balconies, especially if you live in a densely populated city. They can be created pretty much anywhere that there's some space for a pot or some ground. So a few key priorities with native plant gardening. Obviously, having native plants, sometimes easier said than done. If you're new to creating habitat and you're not sure, where do I even get these plants? Sometimes you got to drive quite a ways to find a native plant nursery. But native plants, very important. Another factor is having host plants. So these host plants are plants that certain pollinator species depend on to lay their eggs on and as a food source for their young when they emerge. So probably the more obvious one that a lot of people will think of is milkweed as a host plant for the monarch butterfly. So milkweed's kind of the one plant that monarchs can lay their eggs on, and then the monarch caterpillars will then feed on the milkweed. Another factor that I mentioned earlier is you want to have plants that bloom from spring until fall. So you want to have some plants that bloom early spring. This is the time where a lot of pollinators are searching for food and there's not as much in bloom. So this is important. And then moving into kind of spring, later spring, summer, this is when a lot of things are blooming. Nice to have things then, but then also moving into the fall before pollinators overwinter. Really important to have plants blooming at that time so they've got food going into their overwintering. One other factor, eliminating pesticide use. And this should be an easy one when we're talking about native plant pollinator gardens because there's not really any need to use pesticides in these spaces. So I do have a couple of pictures here just to provide examples through this next series of slides about different municipalities taking action. So the first picture I've got on the left, this is a garden in Mono, Ontario, which a lot of community members participate in maintaining this garden, and the municipality provides quite a bit of funding for this garden too, which is awesome. The second picture I've got there is from a cemetery planting in Niagara Falls. And this is a planting that the municipality actually organized as a community planting event to create habitat. And this is at a cemetery, which is a cool example. Often cemeteries have quite a bit of grass, so you can create habitat there, and then it's nice for the people that are visiting as well. One that I'm really excited about here, cities dedicating resources to the propagation and distribution of native plants. A lot of valuable greenhouse space does end up getting devoted to non-native, more ornamental plants. Think of the plants that get put into hanging baskets. They get put into parks and are kind of replaced throughout the year, depending on the season. These are plants that a lot of resources get put into growing, and then they need to be kind of grown again and again. And often these are plants that really aren't providing too much value to wildlife. So when municipalities devote greenhouse space to growing these native perennial plants, they can actually increase native plant populations, of course, but also over time can decrease their costs because they're just not having to grow quite as much. Ideally, they can be collecting seed from within the city limits and just growing plants and increasing habitat year after year. So a couple examples here, Guelph. has a really great native plant propagation program. I think it started in 2019, so it's been going for about 5 years now. Uh, and they're at the point where they're growing 60 different species of native plants each year within their greenhouse. Uh, they collect seed throughout the city, use that to grow plants out in the greenhouse, and then integrate these into city plantings. Um, Another example is Whitby, Ontario. They've got a program called Seeds for Bees. I think it's heading into its 4th year, and it's a very similar program to what Guelph is doing. Next, urban development habitat standards. So this is important. This is a way for municipalities to make sure as they're developing, they're also thinking of pollinators. So you can be doing quite a bit of development that's taking away habitat and isn't necessarily compensated for by creating the occasional pollinator garden. It's important that as all this development is happening, habitat is being created and we're being mindful of any habitat that's being removed. So these standards can include all kinds of things. They can include minimum requirement for native plants being integrated into new development projects, minimum requirements for nesting space even. They can also include incentives for developers to go above and beyond, such as by creating green roofs that native plants can be grown on. One example here, Toronto has the Green Standard, which is a good example. It includes some minimum native habitat requirements and also incentives for green roofs. This is an interesting one and not one that people are often thinking of. Advocate for delayed yard waste collection in your municipality. And ideally, advocate for it to be delayed until temperatures have been consistently about 10 degrees for a couple of weeks. As an individual, simply just don't do your yard cleanup until then. You've got control over your own yard. But delaying this yard waste collection is a great way to kind of implement it on a municipal level so that people throughout the municipality are a little less likely to get out there and start tidying up plant material. And the reason for this is that it ensures hibernating pollinators have enough time to emerge from the plant material that many of them overwinter in. Because often people can get out there, they're cleaning up their garden, taking plants, putting them in a yard waste bag, and there's actually pollinators still overwintering in that material, and it's being taken. So there was an amendment that was proposed to delay yard waste collection in Toronto. This was a couple years ago now. Unfortunately, it did not pass. So sad end to that story, but hopefully at least it set the stage for future attempts in Toronto and other cities. So one big one that we're seeing come up again and again is the importance of having lawn bylaws that don't restrict habitat creation, particularly on aesthetic grounds. So one of the major issues with a lot of these existing bylaws is that they include quite a bit of vague language. So they include words often like messy and unkept. Thinking about these terms, they're terms that can be subjectively interpreted pretty easily by people that are creating gardens in their yards, but also by the bylaw officers that are doing the enforcement. A lot of people enjoy turf lawns. Turf lawns have lots of benefits, particularly recreationally, but they don't provide much value ecologically. So the important thing with these bylaws is we want to make sure as long as people are doing it safely, people should be able to have a turf lawn. They should be able to naturalize the entire yard, provide lots of habitat. They should be able to have neat pollinator gardens, or even have low growing flowering plants in addition to their turf. So there's all kinds of options that people can have, but a lot of the time these bylaws were created with just the conventional turf grass lawn in mind, and they're not really equipped for people that are doing naturalization projects. So my recommendation is to advocate for bylaws that focus on health, the health of people, the health of native plant communities, and that have nothing to do, ideally, with aesthetics. So this can be done by adopting a prohibited plants list. Often, instead, these bylaws will kind of vaguely prohibit having tall weeds. They might say weeds, or it might have an actual height restriction that's just general to plants. Ideally, instead, it's a prohibited plants list. And then this list can be incredibly clear. It doesn't matter how high the plant is, it just matters that it's on the list. And these plants should only include plants that are either invasive, so a threat to native plant communities, or noxious and threatening to people, things like poison ivy. Height restrictions can be included, but they should be limited exclusively to turf grass, which itself should be very clearly defined in the bylaw. What is turf grass? Often municipalities, the main concern is that they don't want to allow people to grow their turf grass really high, particularly with abandoned properties in mind. So having this height restriction limited to turf grass kind of eases the apprehension municipalities have about that, without really taking away opportunities from people that are trying to intentionally create habitat. The tall turf grass isn't doing much to support pollinators. Of course, one other reasonable thing is to prohibit plants in locations that are blocking important pedestrian and driver sight lines. That's a matter of safety. Important that that's still included. And then once these changes have actually been made to the bylaw, the next important step is educating bylaw officers, because officers are used to the old bylaw. They're having to enforce a whole bunch of things. So you give them a plant list, they might not be able to identify the plants on the prohibited list. So providing training to the officers is a critical next step to make sure that the bylaw is enforced appropriately. Another important one is enabling and even encouraging residents to plant on their boulevards, sidewalk strips, sometimes they're called, the area of land in between the road and people's properties, or the road and the sidewalk that often really isn't doing much. There's a group in Mississauga called Blooming Boulevards. They do really good work supporting people that want to create these gardens. They do this through site visits, expertise, even providing plants. And then the city of Mississauga itself allows for this boulevard planting. So an example of a municipality where a lot of the barriers to boulevard planting have been removed. Another great thing that cities can do is to get the right plants to people and to support this financially. So they can host sales, they can do giveaways, to ensure that people have access to native plants at reasonable prices and accessible locations. As I mentioned earlier, often native plant nurseries are kind of a drive out of the city, can be difficult to actually get. So if cities are bringing those plants in locally, for example, to downtown, and providing them at a subsidized rate, this can go a long way to make sure people are able to plant the right things. Another option is cities can provide rebates. So this is where they might outline which species are acceptable and then provide reimbursements for people that purchase those plants. I've seen this in a number of cities, such as Collingwood and Okotoks in Alberta. They can also provide grant opportunities for habitat projects. So for example, in Toronto, they've got Pollinate TO grants where community members can apply and receive funding for their community habitat project, which is great. And the final one for this habitat section, offering garden consultations to people that want to create habitat. Often people are interested in doing this, but they don't know exactly how to go about it. They might not be sure what plants are going to work well with the level of sun I have, with my soil type, things like that. So if you have someone associated with the city that can actually go out and provide consultations, or even someone from a nonprofit that the city is funding, this can be a really good way to get people the information they need to create habitat. The city of Guelph has a program like this called Healthy Landscape Visits, where staff will visit your home, take a look at your yard, talk to you, and give you information about how you might go about doing what you want to do. So that was habitat, and that's really the big section. And now I'm just going to share a little bit about how municipalities can do education and engagement. One option is to use signage, both to educate about pollinators and if they're participating in Bee City, their participation in Bee City. Signage can be a really effective way to reach people that otherwise might not be even thinking about pollinators. Ideally, signage can be placed in areas with high foot traffic. Think of those downtown, potentially demonstration gardens. Even potentially natural areas where people are already going and interested in learning about nature. A couple of examples on this slide. There's one sign there for Mississauga. They've got some nice signage at a native plant garden located in a park there. In Calgary is the second example. They do a really great job capturing attention through their bee buoys, is what they call them. Essentially, they're repurposed buoys that are designed to look like bees. Pretty fun. I know Calgary at times has actually also placed staff at booths out in new naturalized areas. A lot of the time, members of the public might see a new naturalized area, think that the city's actually abandoned the area because things might be growing taller, and they might report a complaint. So by having people actually there that work for the city and can explain the intentionality of what the city's doing with naturalized areas, that can really go a long way for public education. Another one is to provide pollinator-related training to employees. Of course, educating the community is really important, but it's especially important that city staff that might be involved in land management decisions, outreach with the public, that they have a lot of knowledge about pollinators. So I did mention earlier that Pollinator Partnership Canada offers a pollinator stewardship certification training. And we actually have provided this to several bee cities. We've kind of done tailored trainings for cities. I know in addition to this, there's some cities that have actually done their own internal training. Typically, this is training that's led by one particularly passionate staff member. They put it together and then train their team, which is another really great way to go about it. Community habitat creation events. This is another really good way to engage people, also provide information to them about how they can create habitat at home. Just a couple examples, got Kawartha Lakes. They do an annual event called Biking for Pollinators, where residents will bike with native plant seed bombs. So they've got the soil and the seed, and then they throw it while they're on their bike ride and add to native plant communities. And then the other example here, this is from King Township, where they have classes out to their Cold Creek Conservation Area to add to habitat areas. One last one here, promoting community science efforts. This is a good way for residents to learn about pollinators, but also to collect really valuable data. So there's a thing called the City Nature Challenge. This is a really cool way for cities to engage in community science because it's a time where lots of cities are competing to see how many species can be identified in each city. There's also Mission Monarch. This is a really cool program that's based out of Montreal that's focused on documenting monarchs and monarch caterpillars. And then the last section, and this one's kind of a fun one, celebrating Pollinator Week. And of course, there's other days to celebrate things like World Bee Day, but this is the main one we focus on through Bee City. One really good way is to host a Pollinator Week festival. This could take place ideally near a habitat area. You can have booths for vendors, educational opportunities. You can see in the picture on the left, this is a festival Waterloo Region did, and they've got face painting for kids. They're doing bees and butterflies and things like that. You could also do plant giveaways at these festivals so that people can go home and plant. Another example is King Township. They did a pollinator event. I know they had lots of vendors there. You can see kind of the promotional material for that one. And then one last action that I'll touch on, creating pollinator-themed public art. So this could include murals, sculptures, funky bee hotels, really any kind of especially community-created art where the community's involved. Often these are really beautiful and a really good way to capture people's attention, similar to signage, but even better because they're often a lot more beautiful. On the left, you can see a picture of Toronto's Sweat Bee mural. This is in the Annex neighborhood, created by Nick Sweetman. I was lucky enough to live, I think, about 5 minutes away from here at one point. It's a really cool mural. And then another example here I've got, this is from King Township. They call it Flutter by the Butterfly. And this is an art piece that's composed of a whole bunch of individual puzzle pieces that were painted by members of the community that they kind of like brought together into this art piece. So really good opportunity for community involvement. So that's it for my talk. Hopefully you found it interesting or helpful. Maybe there's even something you'd be interested in doing to support pollinators if you're not already. And happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
First of all, thank you for the really passionate presentation. And we've actually had a really awesome audience that are writing in lots of questions. So I'll just try to give a few to you, kind of rapid fire. And there's no way we're going to make them through them all, but we'll try our best. So Michael and Jennifer are wondering about how do you convince your town or your city to kind of get on the pollinator bandwagon? Do you have any resources available for people?
Yeah, and it can be really tough. What I've noticed through Bee City is often it can be really easy to join Bee City if there's one city councilor that's really into it and brings the idea forward, or if there's people that are working for the municipal government that are really into it. And then they bring it forward. Often it's people in parks. So probably the best way is if you happen to know anyone in council or anyone working for the municipal government to get in touch with them and try to make things happen. I have also seen some cities actually, a resident will come give a presentation to council about pollinators, talk about Bee City, and it's something that the council members honestly just hadn't really even thought of. But then they see this and they're like, oh, this sounds great. So a little harder going in that case. But if that is something that you might be interested in doing, we've got like a little PowerPoint that we give out to people that want to do that. And I'm happy to talk with anyone that wants to do that. So lots of options, but ideally there's somebody internally that can bring it forward.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, it sounds like a municipal council here turned down the suggestion of banning glyphosate. So it seems like we need all the help we could get. And you mentioned that you have a guide available for municipalities. Is there a way that people can get a hold of that?
Totally. Yep. It's on the Bee City website.
Okay.
I'm just pulling it up real quick because I can stick it in the chat. It's pretty long. It's about 100 pages and it's got all of
Yeah.
so I mentioned some of the actions in the presentation.
Okay.
But there's a whole bunch more in there and then lots of examples.
Oh, that's awesome. And if people want to get the presentation, they can just touch base with you directly there.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I did, I
Awesome.
sent the link to the handbook, but I think it only went to
Perfect.
the host and panelist.
Oh,
Might have to distribute that after.
yeah, I can probably send it right now to everyone. I've definitely done that before.
Awesome.
There we go. Um, so our next question is from Roger. Do mosquitoes pollinate any plants? He's heard that they pollinate Saskatoon berries.
Yeah, mosquitoes can definitely be pollinators. I know it's interesting because everybody tends to love bees, and then there's some pollinators where it's a little bit more complicated, often wasps. Uh, but wasps, there's 100,000 species, and they do things like pest control and agriculture. But mosquitoes are probably, they might be the most complicated one where, yeah, there's definitely particular species that are important pollinators. I think it varies quite a bit by species. But we got to respect that the world is complex and there's animals doing pollinating like wasps. I know it can be a mixed bag, but it's definitely some mosquitoes are important pollinators.
Well, that's good to hear. They're not just a nuisance.
Yeah.
And one of our attendees is wondering if you know anything about massive solar farms and wind turbines and if they have any impact on pollinators.
Interesting. I know through Pollinator Partnership in the US, they've done quite a bit of work on solar projects. And there's actually quite a few projects where people are integrating habitat into solar areas. Um, so that's really interesting. I think there's quite a bit of potential there to actually integrate habitat into the solar areas. Um, I'm not as familiar with the wind, but I imagine there's probably a lot of similar projects. It's just a great spot to create habitat because pollinators are often moving close to the ground. I don't see how there'd be. It seems like a really good place for habitat because often utility lands is where a lot of habitat is created because there's the wires and um, you can't necessarily plant tall trees there, but you can do kind of a meadow habitat. So I imagine that's a good spot for that.
Okay. And Sarah says that she's the owner of a garden center and a landscaper and has a greenhouse. And unfortunately, despite best efforts, greenhouses tend to act as an ecological trap for pollinators. Do you have any suggestions for structural design of greenhouses to limit the amount of insect mortality?
Oh, that's really interesting. I honestly had not thought about that. I think it makes me wonder how the pollinators are getting in, like if it's closed off. And I
Mhm.
know, like I've thought about greenhouses in the context of often for tomato and other crops, people will actually bring in colonies of bumblebees that have been produced by companies for specifically greenhouse pollination. And in those cases, I know there's concerns about bumblebee colonies that are produced by certain companies actually having more sort of pests and diseases because there's so many bees being produced in a small space. So in those cases, the concern is actually not wanting the bumblebees to be able to leave the greenhouses because then they could pass those things on to the wild populations. But I hadn't thought about it in that way, so I don't have a good answer. That's
Okay, that's
interesting.
okay. Yeah, it is. Um, and a listener named Michael says, could you elaborate on avoid insecticides? Like, should it be a municipal wide ban? Do cities pick and choose when, where, and what type of insecticide? Or is it just sort of a recommendation for homeowners?
I know it can be pretty complicated. I'd say if you're a homeowner, ideally just don't use them or try to find something that's relatively not harmful. If you're creating habitat at home, we often just don't need insecticides. It's usually more in a matter of agriculture. Because, for example, if you're trying to use chemicals on things like grass, or like, maybe we just shouldn't be putting our resources into that. But in terms of agriculture, I know it can be very complicated in terms the trade-off of growing food and making sure things are safe. So I think it does really depend regionally on what, like down to the local, what are the threats that we're anticipating and what are we going to use in response if we see evidence of this threat being a major problem. Uh, the big thing is to avoid kind of prophylactic treatments of crops. I know often I studied in particular neonicotinoids and their impacts on
Mm.
the sublethal impacts on bees, and often the seeds are coated and then the plants are planted. So no matter what, they're integrated into the plant, and then bees are exposed through pollen and nectar when they're feeding. Um, so ideally, less prophylactic treatment, and it's more you have a plan for what might happen locally. So integrated pest management is good to look into.
Okay, that makes sense. And David is wondering, he says that many municipalities have a fairly aggressive tree cutting bylaw that requires replacement tree plantings, tree canopy targets, but there's no credit given to providing non-tree plants. Do you know of any examples where non-tree plants are used to offset tree?
Interesting. Um, like in the sense of municipalities are providing kind of financial incentives or support
Mm-hmm.
for. Yeah, there are.
Non-trees, yeah.
There's good programs there. I know in Okotoks, it's mainly actually about water conservation, and they provide, I think, a 40% rebate on, I don't know what the cap is, but on it's a certain native plants that are good for having kind of drought tolerance. Um, so that's one, and I know Collingwood provides a rebate. Collingwood in Ontario, it's I think $150, and it's a 50% rebate, so you can get up to $300 of native plants, and you get half that back. Um,
Okay.
so those are two I'm aware of, but they're not as popular as I would love for them to be.
Yeah, yeah. Well, awesome. Thanks for answering that question. And I know that we're out of time here, so I just want to pass on a few comments that people have written in. Branimir, who's been a past presenter, said that there's local pollinator-friendly activities for the Saskatoon area, and people can check out wildaboutsaskatoon.org. Um, there's also a lot of interest in some of the programs that you've mentioned, Jordan. Um, does your organization have a branch in Alberta or Saskatchewan, or you're just based out of Ontario?
So we are based out of Ontario, but we definitely do work across the country. We're a very small team. There's in Canada like six of us. I've got one colleague that actually lives in Yellowknife. I've got a colleague that lives in Victoria. There's a few of us in Ontario. So we definitely do work across the country, and often our programs, for example, Bee City, it's like very for us education focused, and we're providing resources to people. So we don't tend to do habitat projects ourselves because we don't kind of have the internal
Mm.
capacity. So we're more focused on the education to get people what they need to be able to do that locally.
Yeah, well, it's very inspiring. Like I'm super motivated to get out there and start a pollinator garden, and I'm just waiting for the snow to melt and looking out the window
Me
and
too.
stuff. Um, with that, I just want to thank you so much, Jordan, for the really inspiring presentation and how informative and detailed it was. I know it was really well received by our attendees. We've had a few people writing in to say awesome information, great information, ideas on action that we can take. So hopefully, as a result of this, we have a bit more pollinator habitat this year going into the future. So thank you, Jordan.
Yeah, thank you. And let's get our first Saskatchewan Bee City. That'd be
Yes,
amazing.
that would be really, really exciting. That would be. To all of our attendees, thank you so much for watching today's webinar. If you haven't already registered, we have lots more webinars happening this week for Prairie's Got the Goods Week, as well as our coffee table conversations about some lifelong agricultural producers to sort of hear about why they do what they do. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you online in the future. Bye now.
Thank you.